Okay, so this is the March 2019 Passage 4. This is the paired passage. So we're going to start out by reading this introductory information. Passage 1 is adapted from Albert Luthel's speech to the South African Congress of Democrats delivered in 1958. So this is actually kind of exciting because for a global conversation piece, this is fairly recent. Passage 2 is adapted from Macmillan's address to the South African Parliament delivered in 1960. At the time of these speeches, South Africa was in the process of transitioning from a British colony to an independent republic under a system of white minority rule known as apartheid. Luthuli was the president of the African National Congress, a group advocating equality for black South Africans. Macmillan, the Prime Minister of Britain, was addressing the all-white South African Parliament. Okay, so we're going to diagnose for Passage 1 first. In Passage 1, he argues that South Africa will become fully democratic country only when black South Africans do something. So in Passage 1, this is a content characterization. It does not have a follow-up, so we need a box of information. So it'll become fully democratic only when black South Africans do or have something. Number 33, Luthuli refers to in order to. So this is going to be a purpose function question. And we're looking at line 17, and we're asking ourselves, why does he use this phrase? Sometimes very nice and pretty phrases are used. Number 34, when Luthuli describes the version of a democratic society in South Africa as realizable in 2 lines, he means that this version can be. Okay, this is almost a word in context. It's not phrased the way we're used to seeing it, but we're trying to figure out the meaning behind this word realized, and it's used in 2 separate lines. So 36 and 37. So we'll read through that and kind of identify the meaning behind that word. Question 35 asks about Passage 2, so we're going to stop diagnosing here, and we're going to look for South Africa becoming fully democratic when. We'll stop and talk about the purpose of this line, very nice and pretty phrase, and then the word realizable. So those of us who are in the freedom struggle in this country have really only one gospel. We may possibly shade it in different ways, but it is a gospel of democracy and freedom. If we are true to South Africa, that must be our vision, a vision of South Africa as a fully democratic country. Okay, so fully democratic is talked about here. It cannot in honesty be claimed that she is yet really democratic when only about 1/3 of her people enjoy democratic rights, and the rest, notwithstanding the fact that they constitute the majority, are still subjugated to apartheid rule. Okay, so the people, the majority, who are not enjoying democratic rights and are still subjugated to apartheid rule are the black South Africans. Okay. I emphasize the words are still because I do believe firmly that it is not a state that can be perpetuated. Apartheid rule is the antithesis of democracy. Apartheid, in theory and practice, is an effort to make Africans march back to tribalism. Sometimes very nice and pretty phrases are used to justify this diversion from the democratic road. Okay, so to justify this diversion. So he's saying that we use these nice and pretty phrases in order to qualify or say that it's okay that we have gone away from democratic means. The one that comes to mind is the suggestion that we Africans will develop along our own lines. I do not know of any people who really have developed along their own lines. My fellow white South Africans enjoying what is called Western civilization should be the first to agree that this civilization is indebted to previous civilizations from the East, from Greece, Rome, and so on. For its heritage, Western civilization is really indebted to very many resources, both ancient and modern. The essence of development along your own lines is that you must have the right to develop and the right to determine how to develop. In essence is freedom, and beyond freedom, self-determination. This is the vision we hold for our future and our development. One might ask, is this vision of a democratic society in South Africa a realizable vision? Or is it merely a mirage? I say it is realizable. So we can realize it means that it's maybe possible. For it is the nature of man to yearn and struggle for freedom. The germ of freedom is in every individual and anyone who is a human being. In fact, the history of mankind is the history of man struggling and striving for freedom. Indeed, the very apex of human achievement is freedom and not slavery. Every human being struggles to reach that apex. Okay. So South Africa will become fully democratic country only when black South Africans, so currently they are still subjugated under apartheid, and they say that we can't refer to South Africa as fully democratic because of this idea that only a third of the people enjoy democratic rights. So, enjoy the same rights as white citizens, that's a possibility. Have economic as well as political power. Political and economic power are not necessarily discussed, it's just freedom. Form their own political organization, so that would be separating, and that's not what is being discussed here. Or constitute a majority of the government. They don't necessarily need to be a majority of the government, and they already are a majority of the population, so it's not D. So we just want to enjoy the same rights as the white citizens. Luthuli refers to very nice and pretty phrases, primarily to show that the language being used is being used in order to... Okay, so we talked about this word justifying this divergence or going away from the democratic order. So are they rectifying an intolerable situation? No, they're not fixing it, they're justifying it. Obscure and indefensible governing system? Maybe, because it is indefensible and they're trying to cover it up with pretty language. So B is a possibility. Undermine outspoken critics of the government. Okay, we're not undermining them. And it's especially not critics. Depict the daily experience of the majority of citizens. We don't really know what the experience is based on that word. So it has to be that they are trying to kind of cover up things that the author of this piece sees as indefensible. Okay, when Luthuli describes the vision of democratic society as realizable, and we talked about this as like possible, so acquired, that's not quite right. They're not going to find it or come into possession of it. It's not about understanding it. Achieve would work because like it is a possibility. Can we actually do this? They are currently pursuing it, so it being realizable is not about the pursuit, it's about the achievement, the final result. Okay, so paragraph 1, or passage 1, I'm sorry, asserts this idea that for South Africa to be democratic, fully democratic, the black South Africans, which constitute a majority, need to enjoy the same rights as the white South Africans, who are only a third of the population. So now we can move on to passage 2 and diagnose these questions. In passage 2, Macmillan implies, okay, so that's an inference and suggestion, and we have a COE follow-up. In passage 2, he presents his argument by, so this would kind of be a how does he present his argument? So this will actually be a purpose function question. And then let's see, the following question is a COE pair to the first one, so let's make a really big line here so that we remember to use this as a COE and not try to answer it on its own. Okay, so this one is a COE pair. Luthuli would most likely respond to Macmillan. Okay, so this is going to be where our synthesis questions start, so we can stop here. And it looks like everything for this passage is a COE pair, so let's just read. And we'll make notes of things that we think are important. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and we must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. Of course, you understand this better than anyone. You are sprung from Europe, the home of nationalism, and here in Africa you have yourselves created a free nation, a new nation. Indeed, in the history of our times, you'll be recorded as the first of the African nationalists. And this tide of national consciousness which is now rising in Africa is a fact for which you and we and the other nations of the Western world are ultimately responsible. So he's kind of saying that this idea of South Africans wanting equality is something that stems from Western culture. So it's something that the white citizens actually brought to this area. So he's trying to kind of make them a part of it. For its causes are to be found in the achievement of Western civilization. I am sure you will agree that in our own areas of responsibility we must each do what we think right. What we British think right derives from a long experience both of failure and success in the management of these affairs. We try to learn and apply the lessons of both. Our judgment of right and wrong and justice is rooted in the same soil as yours, in Christianity and in the rule of law as the basis of our free society. This experiment of our own explains why it has been our aim in the countries for which we have borne responsibility not only to raise the material standards of life, but to create a society that respects the rights of individuals. Okay, so he's kind of putting this on their shoulders as well. A society in which men are given the opportunity to grow to their full stature. And that must, in our view, include the opportunity of an increasing share in political power and responsibility, a society finally in which individual merit and individual merit alone is the criterion for a man's advancement. Okay, so that's going to be important. Whether political or economic. Finally, in countries inhabited by several different races, it has been our aim to find means by which the community can become more of a community. Okay. And fellowship fostered between the various parts. So in passage 2, Macmillan implies that the growth of national consciousness in Africa is. So we're looking for the growth of national consciousness. 45 through 49. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact. And we must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. Okay, so this does talk about national consciousness, so we might be able to hold on to that one. 53 through 55. A new nation, indeed, in the history of our times, yours will be recorded as the first of the African nationalists, and this tide of national consciousness, which is now rising in Africa, is a fact for which you and we and the other nations of the Western world are ultimately responsible. Oh, I'm sorry. That one is just through nationalists, so it would have stopped here. Okay, so that one does not talk about national consciousness. 58 through 59. For its causes are to be found in the achievement of the Western civilization. Okay, that doesn't talk about national consciousness. 68 through 74. This experience of our own explains why it has been our aim in the countries for which we have borne responsibility not only to raise the material standards of life, but to create a society that respects the rights of individuals, a society in which men are given the opportunity to grow to their full stature. Okay, so this also does not talk about national consciousness. So let's look back at A. The wind of change is blowing through this continent, and whether we like it or not, this growth of national consciousness is a political fact, and we must all accept it as a fact, and our national policies must take account of it. Okay, so fact, fact, fact. So they imply that it is baffling because most African nations function efficiently without strong nationalist movements. Okay, so we don't know anything about most African nations, and it doesn't seem baffling. He's just stating it's a fact. Invigorating because most African nations are ready to embrace diversity. Diversity is not discussed in that line, so we can get rid of that one. Inevitable because nationalism in Africa is a force that cannot be stopped. Okay, so it talks about like winds of change, whether we like it or not. It is a fact, so that one looks good. Remarkable because many Europeans doubted that nationalism would take hold in Africa. Okay, there's no talk of Europeans doubting anything, so it must be C. Okay, Macmillan presents his argument to the South African government by doing what? And this one is a COE pair. So how does he present his argument? And we are looking for lines 50 through 53, 60 through 61, and we'll go through all of these together. I've got them written to the side just to make this a little bit easier. Line 50 through 53. Of course, you understand this better than anyone. You are sprung from Europe, the home of nationalism. And here in Africa, you have yourselves created a free nation. Okay, so we're looking for how he presents his argument to the South African people. So that doesn't really have anything specific, so we can probably get rid of that one. Let's look at 60 through 61. I'm sure you will agree that in our own areas of responsibility, we must each do what we think right. Okay, so this does not talk about how he presents it to the South African government. Let's look at 62 through 64. What we British think right derives from a long experience both of failure and success in the management of these affairs. Okay. And then the last one, 65 through 68. Our judgment of right and wrong and of justice is rooted in the same soil as yours, in Christianity and in the rule of law as the basis of a free society. Okay. And we are looking for, he presents his argument to the South African government, and this is the only one that talks about justice, the rule of law as the basis of a free society. So we're going to hold on to D as our correct answer. Now, using that, are we asserting that they share important values? Yes, this idea of a society based in rule of law as the basis of a free society, right and wrong, Christianity, all these things. He is not urging the government to take a leadership role, acknowledging that South Africa faces greater challenges than does Britain. Okay, so there's no discussion of challenges. Lamenting or crying over the difficulties in sustaining free and just societies. No, so it's just we have similar ideals. Okay. And sorry, number 38, if you remember, is D. Okay, so now we have our synthesis questions. These are going to ask us to consider passage 1 and passage 2 together. So Luthuli, which is passage 1, would most likely respond to Macmillan, passage 2's demand for a society in which all individuals have a share in political power and responsibility by arguing what? So, economic power is more important to black South Africans than political power? No, he never talks about economic power in passage 1. Such a society is impossible as long as apartheid exists in South Africa, so this is the idea of black South Africans not having equal rights, and that goes back to that question about we can't achieve democracy until this is undone, so B is a possibility. Many black South Africans do not want to participate in a corrupt political system. So this is asserting that democracy is the corrupt political system and that they don't want to participate in it, and this would be outside of the scope of the passage. Many black South Africans already have significant political responsibilities. You can't assert that with what is going on in the passage. So this just goes back to that line of as long as they do not have equal rights, a democracy cannot be called a democracy. Okay, so which statement would they most likely agree on about freedom? Just societies give people the freedom to develop as individuals. Okay, so they both did kind of say that, so we can hold on to that. Democracy cannot exist where freedom is in any way compromised. While that's true, that is something more from passage 1 and not necessarily discussed in passage 2. Political freedom must precede economic and social freedom. Neither of them really talked about the order of things. Freedom is directly related to a spirit of nationalism. Unfortunately, the spirit is not always enough to give the freedom, so we cannot choose D. So the correct answer is A. Number 41. The speeches of Luthuli and Macmillan differ in their approach to social change in that. So we can look at just the first portion, and if the first portion is not correct, then we know the full part is not correct. So passage 1 suggests the major social change in South Africa is unlikely to happen anytime soon. He didn't really give a timeline. He was more concerned about what needs to happen for it to be true. Luthuli implies that the people of South Africa themselves will initiate social change. Okay, possibly. While Macmillan emphasizes the role played by those in positions of power. Yes, because he's specifically talking to Congress, so we can hold on to that one. Luthuli states that eliminating apartheid is only the first step toward genuine social change, while Macmillan contends that eliminating apartheid is the ultimate goal. Maybe. Luthuli believes that change in South Africa will come about through collective action, while Macmillan emphasizes the need for a change at the individual level. Okay, so we can get rid of that one. Okay. So Luthuli implies that the people of South Africa themselves will initiate social change, while Macmillan emphasizes the role played by those in positions of power. So let's go take a quick scan. Those of you who are in the freedom struggle in this country have really one gospel. We may possibly shade it differently, but it is a gospel of democracy. If we are true to South Africa, this must be our vision. So he is talking to the individual and how they need to they need to kind of help rise up. Along your own lines is that you must have the right to develop and the right to determine how to develop. In essence, its essence is freedom, and beyond freedom, self-determination. This is the vision we hold for our future and our development. So it's these uses of the phrase our. And then C states that eliminating apartheid is the only first step towards genuine social change, while Macmillan contends that eliminating apartheid is the ultimate goal. There's really nothing to say that he sees this as the ultimate goal, and so because we can't prove that in the passage, the answer choice is B. Okay, so that is everything for passage 3. Okay, so we are on the last passage for the March 2019. This is a natural science passage, and it has a graph. So if you're going to eject core, this might be a good choice, but we're going to go through it as though we have enough time to do it the traditional way. So let's go ahead and start diagnosing questions. Number 42, according to the passage, so that's a content characterization. It does not have a COE follow-up, so we need to look for challenging conventional wisdom. Another C&C, according to the passage, it also does not have a follow-up, so we need to look for something that is true about the 94 Clementine spacecraft mission. Number 44, it can reasonably be inferred. So that's an inference question, and this one does have a COE pair, so we don't have to worry about anything on that one yet. Then we have 2 words in context questions, so resolve in line 44 and drive in line 59. So let's take a look. Resolve in line 44, and then drive in line 59. Okay. The author implies, okay, inference question, and this one has a COE pair. According to the figure, okay, so now we have graph questions, a graph question, and like a graph question with a COE follow-up. So you would have, maybe a tier 2 or tier 3, another tier 2 or tier 3, tier 1, tier 1, tier 1, tier 1, tier 1, and then this says based on the date in the figure, so this is also tier 1 and has a COE, so we should be in good shape. Okay, so we are going to keep our eye out for what happens when you challenge conventional wisdom, something about the Clementine spacecraft mission, and then we have COE pairs, words in context, and graphs. The moon is bone dry by conventional wisdom. Okay, so here's conventional wisdom. Actually drier than bone, which retains a significant water component even when baked in the desert sun. Multiple lines of evidence point to this aridity. Earth-based telescopes reveal no characteristic infrared absorption. Moon rocks from all 6 Apollo landing sites held no detectable traces of water, at least by 1970 analytical standards, and the finding of unrusted iron metal after 4 billion years on the lunar surface would seem to preclude even a trace of corrosive water. It's a funny thing about conventional wisdom. Okay, so we're talking about this again. Eventually someone will challenge it, will challenge what everybody else knows to be true, and once in a while something really interesting will be found. Okay, in 1994, I'm going to star this. In 1994, so now we're in this mission, a single flyby by the Clementine spacecraft mission produced radar measurements that were consistent with water ice, though many planetary scientists were unconvinced. 4 years later, the lunar prospector, so they found measurements that were consistent with water ice. And then 4 years later, the lunar prospector employed neutron spectroscopy to detect a significant concentration of hydrogen atoms and hence possibly water ice or water-containing minerals near the poles. Still, many experts pointed to implanted hydrogen from the sun's solar wind as a more likely source. Then, in 2009, NASA smashed the upper stage of an Atlas rocket into one of the moon's craters and scrutinized the plume of impact debris for signs of H2O. Sure enough, the flurry of dust incorporated a small but significant amount of the life-giving stuff, enough to renew interest in lunar water and its possible origins. 3 back-to-back articles in Science that same October established that evidence for water on the moon is now unambiguous, so it's clear. Enter Eric Hari and his colleagues at the Carnegie Institute using an ion microscope, a highly sensitive instrument that hadn't been available to the first generation of scientists who studied the Apollo samples. Hari's team has revisited the colorful glass beads that collected during the lunar missions in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Other scientists had examined the glass beads for signs of water decades earlier, but their detection capacities were to match for the ion microbe's ability. Were no match for the microscope's ability to resolve measurements at the scale of a millionth of an inch. So this is like a microscope resolution. So it provides like clarity. It can differentiate between images. Hari and his co-workers polished a variety of glass beads so that their round cross-sections were revealed in the ion probe. The beads' outer rims proved to be very dry, with only a few parts per million water, but the cores of the largest beads, okay, so this is something different, have as much as 46 parts per million of the water. Over billions of years, most of the glass beads' original water has evaporated to space, more from the outsides than from the core. Okay, so the outsides are drier than the core. However, based on the significant amount of remaining water deep inside the beads, Hari and his colleagues calculate that the original water content may have been as high as 750 parts per million, a lot of water, comparable to many volcanic rocks on Earth, and more than enough to drive surface volcanism that would have dispersed magma and explosive eruptions billions of years ago. So to drive, cause, to start, to be a catalyst of, to force. If that much water powered volcanoes in the moon's past, then a great deal of water must be locked somewhere inside the moon's frozen interior. And since the moon formed primarily by wholesale excavation of Earth's primordial mantle during a collision with another massive object, our planet's deep interior likely holds prodigious amounts of unseen water as well. So this talks about how the moon came from Earth. All right, so let's take a look. Challenging conventional wisdom. So if we go back, it says, funny thing about challenging it is eventually somebody will challenge it, and once in a while something really interesting will be found. Okay, usually produces unexpected outcomes. Sometimes, but not usually. Generally occurs outside of scientific circles. That was not discussed. Rarely results in technological innovations. Again, it says occasionally, so we can get rid of rarely. Sometimes leads. Okay, so sometimes leads to significant new insights is closest to the idea expressed in that line. Okay, so which is true about the Clementine space mission? It provided evidence about the moon that was featured in science magazines. Let's see. Let's take a look at that again. The entirety of Clementine is here. In '94, a single flyby by the Clementine spacecraft mission produced radar measurements that were consistent with water ice, though many planetary scientists were unconvinced. Okay, so there's nothing about the science articles yet. It was not specifically designed to detect water on the moon. It offered preliminary indications of water on the moon. Okay. It did not use the most up-to-date radar. All right, so the only thing that we can prove here would be C, that it offers preliminary proof that there might be water on the moon. Number 44, an inference question, and we are looking for the idea that the moon was completely arid was reinforced by what? Okay, so it can reasonably be inferred from the passage that this idea that the moon was completely dry was reinforced by something. So let's look in these line references. Line 8 through 11. The finding of unrusted iron metal after 4 billion years on the lunar surface would seem to preclude even a trace of corrosive water. Okay, so completely arid, reinforced in part. And this says the finding of unrusted iron would preclude even a trace of corrosive water. So that does at least talk about this idea of aridity, it being dry, but I think we can probably do better. Let's look at 12 through 15. It's a funny thing about conventional wisdom, though. Eventually someone will challenge what everyone else knows to be true. And once in a while something really interesting will be found. Okay, so that is pretty vague. It does not talk about the aridity in specifics. So let's go to 15 through 19. In 1994, so we just read this, a single flyby of the Clementine produced radar measurements that were consistent with water and ice, though many scientists were still unconvinced. So that would be the opposite of this assumption about aridity. So we can get rid of that one. 23 through 25. Still, many experts pointed to implanted hydrogen ions from the sun's solar wind as a more likely source of the signal. Okay, so because this is an inference question, D is a better form of evidence than C, than A. So what A says, the finding of unrusted iron metal after 4 billion years on the lunar surface would seem to preclude even a trace of corrosive water. So this is a little too, it seems a little too obvious, but it also does not, it's also not in, doesn't answer the question about it being reinforced. This just gives information, but the reinforcing is not there. This kind of reinforces why people thought that it was arid. They're assuming that is implanted hydrogen from the sun's solar wind. So because they have a secondary explanation, it's reinforced that it is actually arid. So our line of evidence is going to be D. And the idea is reinforced in part, so it's not about analytical tools. It's not about challenging conventional wisdom. Evidence that might have contradicted this notion could be explained in another way. So this is it coming from the sun. Apollo moon rocks were not available in sufficient quantities. Okay, so no, we have access to them. So this one is C. We can explain it with that solar, that information about the solar markups. Okay, as used in line 44, the word resolve. So we talked about this as a microscope that we're looking at, and it is clarifying or differentiating between small items under the microscope. So distinguish between, okay, we talked about that. It's not changing what we're looking at, and it's not converting to, because that's just another form of change. And it's not clearing it out of the way of, so it's just distinguishing between small items under the microscope. And then the word drive, so we talked about this being about cause of volcanic eruption, a lot of water comparable to many volcanic rocks on Earth, and more than enough to cause surface volcanism that would have dispersed magma in explosions. Okay. So it's not coerced because water is not convincing the volcano to erupt. It could be fuel. It's not transporting it, it's not moving it, and then it's not maneuvering it or guiding it in a way. So it's just fueling it, causing it, being the force behind it. Okay, the author implies that any water currently present on the moon. All right, so water currently present on the moon. Let's look at lines 36 through 41. Let me get my line references. 36 through 41, we're looking for water currently on the moon. Using an ion microscope, a highly sensitive instrument that hadn't been available to the first generations of scientists who studied the Apollo samples. Hari's team has revisited the colorful glass beads during lunar missions in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so that does not talk about water currently on the moon. Those samples are from decades ago. Line 53 through 57. Hari and his colleagues calculate that the original water content of the moon's magma may have been as high as this. Okay, that's original content, so not now. 62 through 64. If this much water powered volcanoes in the moon's past, then a great deal of water. Okay, so again, the moon's past, so we can get rid of that one. 65 through 69. And since the moon formed primarily by the wholesale excavation of Earth's primordial mantle during a collision, our planet's deep interior likely holds prodigious amounts of unseen water as well. Okay, so this talks about it coming from the Earth and then like water that's currently in the Earth, so I think we could extrapolate that those two are connected. So we're going to choose 65 through 69 for our lines of reference. Oh, has its primary source on Earth. So we can assert that that's probably true. It's not only in the glass beads. It's not going to increase in volume because everything that we've read said that it decreases over time. Exists in liquid form as well as ice. Okay, that is not discussed in the passage. So it's just this connection to the wholesale excavation from Earth. According to the figure, at what distance from the core is the water concentration with lunar glass bead number 5, 15 parts per million? So glass bead number 5, 15 parts per million, and then we'll just go up on the graph. Okay. So 15 parts per million, so right here, and we'll just draw a line. So it's this little guy right here, which looks like he's kind of just over 100, right at 100. And our answer choices, here we go, 100 micrometers. Oops. All right, number 51. Based on the data in the figure, which choice is a reasonable conclusion about lunar glass bead green number 5? Okay, so let's look at the table real quick, and then we'll look at our lines of evidence. Oh, I'm sorry, these are not connected. We're looking for a claim in the passage. So let's look at this one. Choice is reasonable conclusion about lunar glass bead number 5. So beyond 100 micrometers from the core, water is not detectable. Let's take a look at that. Okay, 100 micrometers, and that's right here. So it can't be that one. That's not true. At no point in time did its water concentration exceed 30 parts per million. Okay. So on the parts per million, so that is right here, but can we support that in the table? So at no point in time did its water concentration exceed. So these are glass bulbs or glass beads that we're studying that were excavated a long time ago, and we know that they have experienced some drying. So if we had studied them at their original, they may have exceeded. So it's this idea that at no point in time makes that one incorrect. Its water concentration at 120 micrometers is approximately half that at its core. So 120 is at 15, and its core is at 30. So that math does work out. It could be C. Its water concentration is 50% less than it once was. Okay, again, we don't know what it once was because we just studied this, so it has to be C. Okay, now we can do the COE. That's a standalone. The figure best supports which claim from the passage? All right, so this is about glass beads, so we know it's gonna have to be where the discussion of glass beads was. So let's go back and look. Line 4, I don't think we're talking about glass beads yet. Multiple lines of evidence point to this aridity. Okay, so that's not about the glass beads. 6 through 8. Moon rocks from all 6 Apollo landing sites held no detectable traces of water. Okay, so that's also not about the glass beads. 25 through 29. Then in October 2009, NASA smashed the upper stage of an Atlas rocket into one of the moon's craters and scrutinized the plume of impact debris for signs. Okay, so that's impact debris. Again, not the beads. 48. The beads, okay, here we go. Outer rims proved to be very dry with only a few parts per million, but the core of the largest beads have as much as this amount of water. So it's saying this is about the beads, so that's a good sign. It's saying that the outside is pretty dry, but the core still has a good source of water. And if you look at, if you look at the graph, distance from the core, so this would be the core, and it is higher than away from the core, which shows that drying. So it is D. All right, and that is everything for the March 2019 passage.